The countdown to the climate change or COP27 summit in Egypt has already started with a number of events, such as the Africa Adaptation Summit held about 2 weeks ago in Rotterdam. The headline issue in the climate change discourse boils down to how the multi-billion-dollar financing requirements of the various projects and initiatives will be sourced, in particular for sub-Saharan Africa. Leila Johnson-Salami is an environment journalist and correspondent. Leila was at the COP26 summit in Glasgow last year, and she's heading to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt next month. Before she gets out, she's joining me here live on the show tonight to discuss Africa adaptation financing issues. Thanks for coming.
Good evening, Mr. Bosun.
It's good to have you here.
Great to be on the Rise Exchange.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming through. This is one perhaps not so sexy topic when you talk about stocks, bonds, and what have you. But this is here it is, a multi-billion-dollar issue that many folks on the street don't even think exists. So, how huge, let's start with that, is the challenge of climate change, in particular for Africa?
It's one of the largest issues affecting Africa today. You know, Africa contributes to the least amount of greenhouse gas emissions, yet Africa is the continent that's most affected by the climate crisis, and Africa is also the continent that receives the least amount of global climate financing, which is also an issue. So for many issues, from drought to desertification, rising sea levels, flooding, etc., these are all issues that continue to affect Africa, and it seems as though there's a $41 billion annual funding gap or financing gap for adaptation in Africa. And Mr. Bosun, just to run you through a couple of the issues here as to why this is a huge issue for Africa. You know, we can take food and nutrition. Security for that is off track. According to the World Bank, in 2020, more than 1 in 5 people in Africa faced hunger. Now, that's more than double the proportion of any other region in the world. Now, by 2050, Africa's population is expected to grow to 350 million people. So the current global warming trajectory is set to be catastrophic for our environment here. You know, we're trying to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, but here in Africa, it could get as bad as 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So these are all of the issues that are playing out, which is why adaptation, which is adjusting to the current and future trends of the issue, is so important.
I was about to ask, when we say climate adaptation, what do we really mean? There are a whole lot of terminologies being bandied around: climate change, sustainability, adaptation. What does it really mean in terms of adaptation? What does it mean?
So in the simplest form, climate adaptation is simply adjusting to current and future trends of climate change. So looking at what the effects of climate change are going to be. Africa, for example, is set to be worst affected by the climate crisis, and seeing how you can adapt to ensure that the effects of that are not so bad in the future. So in terms of sustainable agriculture, we're facing so many issues on the continent now. Net food importers all across the continent, we cannot afford to feed ourselves. We're importing over 80% of our food. Finding ways from now to change around these things. Those are examples of what adaptation would be. Climate resilient infrastructure, making sure that we have the buildings, the roads to sustain natural disasters. That's a huge part of climate adaptation. You know, a lot of funding usually goes to mitigation, which is pretty much trying to lessen the current effects, you know, or that climate change causes, and deal with the crisis at hand, but not enough funding is going towards adaptation, and that's where the focus is now being put on, especially for Africa.
Interested when we talk about, you mentioned earlier about I want to also talk about the help that we're getting from the outside, because we are at the tipping point. We're the most vulnerable. We're emitting less. We're contributing a bit less to the footprint, as it were. But 3% of the global climate financing is what we get out of 100%. So we're net loser, as the case may be. Just going to put it mildly. So, are we getting more external help or support, globally speaking, from what you know?
So this is exactly what we're calling for. I mean, here in Nigeria, according to the Nigerian government, the World Bank, for example, has invested over $2 billion in Nigeria's power sector over the past 5 years. There are organizations like the African Union, for example. You have UKAID, USAID, the European Commission, these bodies that do support Nigeria's transition to some extent. Across Africa, the AFDB, so the African Development Bank, and supranationals like the AFC, the Africa Finance Corporation, are really doing their best to support climate adaptation. And more recently, as we know, the picture's right up there on the screen, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry was in Nigeria today. He was received by Vice President Professor Yemi Osinbajo yesterday, and he met with President Buhari today to discuss Nigeria's energy transition plan, which I'm sure we're going to get into in this discussion.
It's very, very important to have John Kerry, who was a former Secretary of State of the United States and now a special envoy to Joe Biden on this coming to Nigeria. But again, if we dig into the Africa Adaptation Program a little bit further in terms of what were the highlights of the September 5, 2022 meeting just about a week ago in Rotterdam? I'm sure you've gotten a bit of your ear to the ground on what was discussed there. What strategy are we looking at for Africa here on the table?
So in terms of the strategy, you know, this is considered a pre-COP27 summit or meeting, and the main strategy for Africa going into COP27 this year is climate financing for adaptation. That's at the forefront of all discussions and everything Africa is looking for. So main things that were discussed in Rotterdam, firstly, that Africa is at tipping point. We are still recovering from the economic and health shocks that COVID brought Africa's way, driving over 25 million people into poverty. Africa, of course, still being a net food importer, like we just spoke about. Also, Africa being the most vulnerable continent. That's something that was widely discussed. Rapidly increasing climate shocks are expected to hit Africa the hardest. Discussions as well on adaptation finance doubling implementation. Now, one significant development at COP26 was the commitment to bring international finance for adaptation onto an even footing with mitigation. And developed countries agreed to double finance for adaptation by 2025. Now, this is key for Africa, and there were calls in Rotterdam for an implementation plan to demonstrate how these funds are going to flow so that we ensure that Africa is not left behind. Of course, capitalizing Africa's adaptation program and delivering the upstream financing facility for the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which is going to be led by the is being led rather by the Africa Development Bank and the Global Center on Adaptation. I must say, though, Mr. Boason, that while there were monetary commitments made, the Africa Development Bank committed to $12.5 billion in funding for adaptation. There was disappointment at European leaders in particular and wealthy industrial nations. From Europe, I believe commitments were only at $55 million at this particular summit, and that was quite a disappointment to see.
I'm heartbroken.
Yeah. Because
I'm heartbroken.
This isn't a crisis that Africa has caused, right? But yes, this is a crisis that Africa is paying for. So here you have the AFDB saying, look, we've brought forward $12.5 billion now.
We're putting that on the table.
We're putting that on the table.
The deal that the GCA, Global Adaptation, has put it is a $25 billion. And this is Dr. Adesina and the rest of his team at the end. They say, look, we've put $12.5 billion on the table. So let's talk about show me the money. Look at the funding needs from the conference in Rotterdam, between 1.3 to 1.6 trillion dollars in just less than 10 years, because annually, so we'll be looking at between 120 and 145 billion US dollars.
Absolutely, about 118 to 145 billion dollars annually to implement Africa's commitments to the Paris Agreement and nationally determined contributions as well. That's coming right from the African Development Bank, you know. And if this current trend of just 3% in global climate finance coming into Africa continues, then the climate financing gap is going to reach $100 to $127 billion a year through to 2030.
So we're never getting there with the current 3% figure? We
are never getting there with the current 3% figure. And, you know, one thing that I'm sure we'll get into in a second as well is here in Nigeria, Nigeria's energy transition plan is a huge project for Nigeria, and our transition to become net zero by the year 2060. And if financing for adaptation isn't looking that great, it doesn't really make you hopeful about financing for Nigeria's net zero transition plan. And Mr. Boason, quite a lot of money is needed for that.
I'm going to talk about Nigeria. I want us to go first to talk about South Africa. If you look at South Africa out of the COP26, and there were talks about whether South Africa will be getting 180 to 200 billion US dollars. They're trying to move very quickly in terms of renewables and what will be done in South Africa. Eskom is talking about it despite its troubles. A couple of big chain stores in South Africa are thinking of supporting manufacturers with some level of renewable energy source, at least about 4 of them, to get the whole issue started. So do you think we're having more initiatives done in South Africa than we're doing in the rest of the continent?
Well, you know, South Africa does contribute to more greenhouse gas emissions than any other country in Africa. So South Africa having, you know what I mean, more commitments to renewable energy projects is not surprising. And I think we have some graphics, if we can get them up, that show the top emitters over time. And you will see that since the start of the industrial age, which is 1750 till now, the only African country listed among the top emitters over time is South Africa. But news did come out yesterday that some South African renewable energy projects have reached a $4 billion financial close, which is about $230 million. I don't want to get my maths wrong there, or my conversions wrong there. So 2 companies, an energy solutions company and a solar company, reached that financial close on 2 registered 100 megawatt energy projects, and I believe that can help out about 40,000 or just under 40,000 homes, because 100 megawatts can power about 16,400 homes. Now, this is the largest corporate renewable energy power purchase agreement in Africa, or said to be. And this is news that came out yesterday. I must also add, Mr. Boaton, you know, South Africa have a carbon tax framework, and that's one of the most popular discussions in the environment scene at the moment. You know, you have the voluntary carbon markets and compliance markets, like in the EU, which is the largest compliance market in the world. California also have a compliance market, but South Africa do too. And what South Africa do is they give businesses a 10% tax break on their carbon tax, but you have to take that 10% and invest it into the voluntary carbon market, and that's encouraging for businesses and encourages them to do so exactly, because they also get to choose the projects.
So we take it all back home to Nigeria, where we've seen the Nigerian gas master plan, in which we've said, look, gas is a new future, and then we had the Polish president here in Nigeria over the last few days. Mr. Vice President went to the United States. He was pushing debt for climate swap deal as well. He sold that idea to Kamala Harris and the rest of our team in the US. And then you've got John Kerry here. So it looks like the world is beginning to ask Nigeria to step up. Now, tomorrow, we're going to sign the West Africa, the gas pipeline between West Africa, Nigeria, and Morocco. That's going to be in Rabat tomorrow. I'm sure you're watching that as well to see. So this is your field. Everything energy has to do with adaptation and climate. So do you think Nigeria is beginning to take those baby steps all ahead of COP27?
Absolutely, I would say so. You know, shortly after President Buhari announced Nigeria's 2060 net zero goal last year, Nigeria, yes, so net zero by 2060, Nigeria unveiled the energy transition plan. And just to give you a couple points on Nigeria's energy transition plan, which has been fully approved, $1.9 trillion is required to get to net zero by 2060. And that is also including $410 billion above projected usual spending, which translates to about $10 billion annually. Now, Nigeria is looking to raise the first $10 billion ahead of COP27 that's coming up in November this year. So that's something that's been put out there on the table. They'd like to kickstart the implementation of the ETP with that initial $10 billion. And it's very promising. At the end of the day, it's good to see a plan like this, but how achievable is it? You know, if you look at the plan in detail, it also discusses things about the job creation side of things and how many jobs are going to be created. But all of this needs financing. Yes. So Nigeria needs to go to COP27 ready to come out of that with the right partnerships, ready to ensure that it's pushed for the right pacts and commitments, and ready to also stand its ground as a nation that genuinely needs support. You know, African nations have to ensure that they don't necessarily feel bad, for lack of a better word, for asking for this money, because this isn't Africa's problem that's been created. We need a
just energy transition.
Absolutely.
And we need to be part of the new world of adaptation and a better climate.
We need equality in climate change, in the climate crisis.
Yes, we need quality of lives, but we also need to reduce and cut out energy poverty on the African continent. Absolutely. So you head into Sharm el-Sheikh in a couple of weeks down the line for COP27. What will be the key things you'll be looking to listen to as far as what you call the common a line of thoughts that Africa should present to the table? Just about a minute.
I do hope to attend this November, especially in terms of climate financing. This year is very important. You know, the big question now is, has the climate crisis become a secondary issue because of the energy crisis in Europe that's been triggered by Russia's war in Ukraine? It does seem as though some countries are softening on their agreements and pacts. So that's going to be at the forefront of discussions at COP27 because the momentum has died down a bit in the past year.
There's a bit of a dampening.
Yeah, exactly. So progress, we're looking for progress, and we are also looking for new agreements and new partnerships for Nigeria. $1.9 trillion for our energy transition plan.
Because this is going to be taking place on the African continent for the first time,
yeah.
Do you think the big voice will be there? The big nations will be there?
They certainly will be there. The hope, however, is that with it taking place in Africa, there is enough focus on Africa. We need to ensure that a lot of focus is put on Africa at this continent. And I mean, I hope that with it being in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, that's a starting point for that to happen. Because to go back to what I said at the beginning, just to wrap this up very quickly, Africa contributes the least, yet Africa faces the worst from the crisis. So there we go.
Don't punish us for what we did not do.
You got it.
Yeah, that's the last line. Don't punish us for what we did.
Don't punish us, please.
For what we did. Great.
Thanks, Mr. Foster.
It's nice having you.